We also agreed that we will have a mutual inspection of the cell phone with our experts and their experts.
The boat pulls away from Horn Island, 7 people on board. The engine straining after a fight with a failing bilge pump and water rising in the hull. A call for help already made. A tow already underway. 7 people visible in the frame. Nolan Wells is not one of them. This video discusses details from an active investigation. Some claims remain unconfirmed. For weeks now, this case has moved from one contested detail to the next, a timeline that keeps shifting depending on who's telling it, second-hand accounts that don't quite line up, audio that people can't agree on what it says. Newly surfaced footage, obtained and aired this week, doesn't resolve the biggest question hanging over all of it. But it does something almost as important. It takes one of the last open possibilities off the table, and it does it with video, not just someone's word. The footage shows the exact moment Nolan's friend group is towed off Horn Island after their boat began taking on water. Their bilge pump had failed earlier that afternoon, and with the hull filling faster than anyone on board was comfortable with, they called for help. A private vessel anchored nearby stepped in once the group's request went out, pulling their disabled boat by line back toward the mainland. What the footage shows is plain enough to describe in a sentence: a half-swamped boat under tow. 7 people standing or seated on the deck, clear enough to count one by one. Nolan is not among them. For a case that has spent weeks buried in conflicting timelines and accounts offered days or even weeks after the fact, this is a rare thing to have. This is video. Recorded in the moment, not reconstructed from memory afterward. A visual record of exactly who was on that boat when it left the island and who wasn't. It lines up with something investigators have already heard from 2 other directions. 2 separate witnesses reportedly told law enforcement that Nolan was still on Horn Island when his friend's boat pulled away. Until this footage surfaced, that was witness testimony. Useful, but still just an account, still shaped by memory, by stress, by everyone's instinct to explain their own version of a chaotic afternoon. Now there's footage that appears to back it up. 2 witnesses and a video, all pointing the same direction, all agreeing on the one fact that matters most here. Nolan wasn't on that boat. There's more behind this footage than what's visible on screen. People with direct knowledge of the investigation say authorities already have separate evidence, apart from this video, placing Nolan on Horn Island after his friend's boat had gone. If that holds, it means the window investigators care about doesn't close the moment that boat left the dock. It stretches forward into hours that, outside of the investigation itself, nobody has fully accounted for yet. Look closely at the footage and there's a detail easy to miss on a first watch. The person standing at the helm steering the boat as it's towed back toward the mainland appears to be on a phone call. On its own, that's nothing unusual. People make calls in the middle of emergencies. A boat is taking on water, a tow is arranged, and it would make sense for someone to want a parent, a friend, anyone on land to know what's happening in real time. But in a case built on reconstructing minutes and movements down to the smallest detail, everything gets a second look. Who that call was to, what was said, whether it has anything to do with Nolan at all, or whether it's simply a young man calling someone while his boat gets hauled home half sunk. Investigators haven't said, and that's the pattern running through nearly everything connected to this case. Every new detail raises a question. Almost none of them come with an answer attached. It's worth sitting with why a detail this small gets this much attention. In most footage, in most cases, a person on a phone mid-emergency wouldn't register as significant at all. Here it does, because so little else from that afternoon has been captured on camera. Investigators have spent weeks reconstructing this day almost entirely from witness accounts, phone records, and a single piece of emergency call audio. Video evidence, especially video that captures a specific, identifiable moment down to who was standing where, is scarce. That scarcity is exactly why this footage is being treated as more than just confirmation that Nolan wasn't on the boat. Every element inside the frame, who's visible, who's on a device, what direction the boat is facing, what the water looks like, becomes something people comb through because there's so little else from that day that exists in this kind of detail. That's also worth noting the risk in a case like this. Not every detail that gets attention turns out to matter. A phone call could be nothing more than someone checking in with a parent to say they were safe. A head count on a boat deck could miss someone stepping below to bail water or standing just outside frame. Footage like this narrows possibilities, but it doesn't eliminate the need for caution in how it's read. Investigators so far haven't publicly weighed in on what the phone call means, if anything. That silence is itself worth noting. In a case this closely watched, an official statement, even a dismissive one, would likely have surfaced by now if there were nothing to it. To place all of this in context, it helps to go back to how the day actually unfolded. Not from the beginning of the case, but from the timeline investigators themselves have laid out. Nolan and his friends had travelled out to Horn Island by boat from a private dock on the mainland to celebrate the 4th of July. One group among what by afternoon was a shoreline packed with hundreds of boats and thousands of people marking the holiday. Horn Island itself is remote, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, reachable only by water, with no permanent population and no infrastructure beyond what visitors bring with them for the day. That remoteness matters. It means there was no fixed set of cameras, no dock workers, no built-in record of who came and went. Anything captured on video that day exists only because someone happened to be filming, for reasons that had nothing to do with what would happen to Nolan hours later. According to the Jackson County Sheriff, Nolan was last seen on the island around 3 o'clock that afternoon. About an hour later, his friend's boat ran into mechanical trouble. The bilge pump gave out, water started coming in. A call went out for help. Nolan's friends have said consistently that they urged him to get on the boat with them before it was towed back. They've said he chose to stay behind. The specific reason shifts depending on which account you're hearing. That he wanted to catch a ride with another group later, that he wanted more time on the island, that it had something to do with a woman he'd been spending time with that day. The details vary. The outcome doesn't. Nolan didn't get on that boat, and by roughly 4:30 that afternoon, according to his friends, it had left without him. What this new footage does is take that single piece of the story, the boat pulling away, Nolan not on it, and move it out of the realm of what people say happened and into something that can be watched. 7 figures on a deck, no 8th. It's a small thing to confirm on its own, but in a case where almost every other detail has come from someone's memory of a stressful day, having even one piece of it locked down by video is not nothing. It also sharpens the timeline in a way that's been easy to lose in a case with this much noise around it. Nolan was on Horn Island as of 3 that afternoon. His friend's boat began taking on water around 4. A call for help went out. A private boat had towed them. By 4:30 they were gone. And at some point after that, how long after is still not settled and depends entirely on which account of a later sighting turns out to hold up. Nolan was still there, alone or with someone, on an island that on the 4th of July had been packed shoulder to shoulder with boats and people, but that would have thinned out hour by hour as the afternoon turned to evening and everyone else started heading home too. He was reported missing that night. What followed was a search effort spanning 2 days, with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department coordinating alongside the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and Gulf Coast Search and Rescue Resources, combing the island and the surrounding water for any sign of him. For a family already anxious after a holiday weekend, those 2 days would have stretched on in a way that's hard to overstate. Search boats working a stretch of coastline that had been full of celebration days earlier, now being worked over for entirely different reasons. 2 days later, on July 6th, Sheriff Ledbetter announced that a body had been found in the water just off the northwestern tip of Horn Island, close to where Nolan had last been seen. His identity was confirmed the following day through dental records, and an autopsy was performed by the state medical examiner, with officials cautioning at the time that full results, including toxicology, could take weeks. In the days after that, the Sheriff's Department made an unusual direct appeal to the public. They asked specifically for original, unedited photos and videos taken on Horn Island on July 4th. Particularly, they said, anything depicting alleged altercations or anything that might include Nolan. They asked if anyone had witnessed an argument, a disturbance, anything unusual that day. It was a request that suggested investigators even early on weren't treating this as a simple, closed case of a young man who wandered off and drowned. They wanted to know what else might have happened on that island while hundreds of strangers came and went. Around this same time, the case took on a dimension that had nothing to do with boats or timelines. In photos from that day, Nolan was often the only young black man among a larger group of friends. That detail, combined with the sheriff's early statement that no foul play was suspected, drew scrutiny and frustration online, with many pointing to Mississippi's history and asking whether that context was being taken seriously enough in how the case was being handled. It's a thread that has run alongside the investigative one from nearly the beginning, and it's part of why this case has drawn national attention rather than staying a local story about a boating accident. Sheriff Ledbetter, for his part, has continued to describe the investigation as active and ongoing, saying publicly that his department has kept in contact with outside agencies, including the FBI, and has leaned on tips from the public to move the case forward week by week. Mississippi authorities have said publicly more than once that the evidence gathered so far points toward an accidental drowning. No indication of foul play, according to officials, a position the sheriff stated within days of the body being recovered, even as the investigation stayed open. More than 60 witnesses have since been interviewed. The FBI has been brought in to assist. Tips from the public, the sheriff has said, have meaningfully moved the investigation forward. That's the official position, restated and unchanged for weeks now. It is not the position Nolan's family has accepted, and it's not a position the public discourse around this case has fully accepted either. Few missing person and death investigations from this past summer have generated the volume of ongoing coverage this one has. New video, new audio, new witness claims arriving on what has felt like a weekly basis since early July. That level of attention cuts both ways. It means more scrutiny on investigators to get this right. It also means more room for unverified claims and half-confirmed details to circulate before anyone's had the chance to check them properly. This footage stands out from a lot of what's circulated in that it comes with sourcing solid enough to stand on. Obtained footage, 7 visible people, corroboration from 2 witnesses already on record. Much of what else has surfaced in this case hasn't cleared that same bar. Within days of his death being confirmed, Nolan's parents retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump, and they commissioned an independent autopsy separate from the one conducted by the state medical examiner. That private examination did not confirm a simple drowning. It came back listing cause and manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. Not a direct contradiction of the state's position, but not an endorsement of it either. A documented formal gap between what Mississippi authorities believe happened to Nolan Wells and what an independent examiner was willing to put in writing. That gap is the reason every new detail in this case, every piece of footage, every witness account, every scrap of audio, gets picked apart the way it does. Not because anyone has proof the official account is wrong, because there is an open, on-record disagreement about what actually happened to an 18-year-old on a crowded island on the 4th of July. And until that disagreement resolves, every new fact either narrows that gap or widens it. It's a disagreement that shapes how footage like this gets read by 2 very different audiences. To investigators working from the theory that Nolan's death was an accident, this video is a small, useful data point. It helps confirm a piece of the timeline they likely already suspected, and it does so with evidence stronger than witness memory. To the family and their legal team working from the position that the full story hasn't been told, the same footage raises a different question. If Nolan wasn't on that boat, and if separate evidence places him on the island afterward, then who else was still there, and why hasn't more been said publicly about what happened in that window? Both readings can be applied to the exact same 7 seconds of video. That's the nature of a case where the underlying facts are agreed upon far more than their meaning is. This footage narrows it. It doesn't answer the biggest question, but it removes one possibility from consideration entirely. Nolan was not on that boat. Whatever happened to him after his friends left the island happened while he was still there. Not on the water, not on the tow line back to the mainland, not somewhere in the miles between Horn Island and dry land. On the island itself. That's a smaller space to account for than it was a week ago. In some ways, it's also a harder one. The answers aren't out on the water anymore, spread across 7 people who can be interviewed and checked against each other's stories. They're somewhere in the hours Nolan spent alone or with someone on a barrier island that by nightfall on the 4th of July would have looked nothing like it did at 3 in the afternoon. Fewer boats, fewer people, less noise, less cover. There's also the matter of that later sighting. Someone has claimed Nolan was seen on Horn Island around 6 that evening, roughly 90 minutes after his friend's boat departed. If accurate, it would mean Nolan was alive and on the island well after the moment this new footage captures. But that account so far rests on second-hand information, someone saying they spoke to somebody else who saw him, rather than a direct witness coming forward themselves. It hasn't been independently confirmed, and until it is, it sits in the same category as much of this case. A claim that could reshape the timeline significantly, but one that isn't yet solid ground to stand on. We still don't know exactly who he was with in those final hours. We don't know precisely when he was last seen alive. We don't know what happened in the stretch of time between his friend's boat pulling away and the moment, 2 days later, that his body was recovered from the water just off that same stretch of shoreline. What we do know is this. A boat left Horn Island that afternoon with 7 people on board. Nolan Wells should have been the 8th. He wasn't. Where this goes next likely depends on whether that separate evidence, the material sources say authorities already hold, placing Nolan on the island after the boat left, becomes public in some form, or whether it stays inside the investigation while officials work to corroborate it against everything else they've gathered. More than 60 witnesses have already been interviewed. It's a safe bet more will be, especially anyone who was anchored near that stretch of shoreline in the hours after this footage was recorded. If the 6 o'clock sighting claim can be nailed down to an actual named witness rather than a second-hand account, that alone would move this case forward more than almost anything that's surfaced so far. If you were anywhere near Horn Island over the 4th of July, or if you know that stretch of the Mississippi coast, drop your location in the comments below. Small details have mattered in this case before. Another boat nearby, another group on the island, anything unusual that afternoon, and they could matter again. Even someone who wasn't near Nolan's group specifically, but who was anchored somewhere along that shoreline between 3 and 6 that evening, could hold a piece of this timeline without realizing it. This case remains active and details may change as the investigation continues. If you want to stay updated as this story develops, consider subscribing to this channel.